Good evening, church. Welcome to Love is an Action, the first part in a four-part series coming up. As we gather together tonight, we are mindful of the recent 1 year mark since the monumental Dobbs versus Jackson Supreme Court decision. The Dobbs decision, as it's most commonly referred, overturned the Roe versus Wade decision, which protected abortion as a part of a holistic approach to reproductive health care. Roe stood as a protected right and a precedent for nearly 50 years, albeit with varying state restrictions and access. Now, 1 year later, we gather as a church to faithfully look at the implications and the real life repercussions of the Dobbs decision. I am Reverend Robin Bless, your moderator for this evening. As a local church pastor, I have sat beside many members of my church, youth and college ministries, and members of my community at large who hold this very real question in their hearts. How do we hold sacred this gift of life in the complexity of living? As a mother, I've had to ask this question myself. What is truly living within the life of God? Thanks in large part to our co-sponsors, the Office of General Minister and President, Disciples Women, and the National Benevolent Association. And through the generous funding from Disciples Women Endowment, tonight our panelists will grapple with the question of what it means to be co-creators with God and to take seriously this call to be stewards of the life and the world around us. What does that mean for the individual and the community at large? Each one of our panelists will respond to our leading questions for tonight's discussion, which are also posted in the public chat. As a leader and a person of faith, how does the Dobbs decision impact your personal and your professional lives? What are the implications of the Dobbs decision in your broader areas of ministry? What impact are you seeing upon the lives and the communities you serve? And finally, perhaps poignantly in this time, as we prepare to assemble as a church in Kentucky, why should this matter to the Christian Church of Disciples of Christ right now? We have a great lineup of panelists for you tonight. We have Reverend Angel Johnson, the Executive Director of Disciples Women. We have Reverend Stephanie McLemore, who is a chaplain and director of Denison University and a member of Helm. We have Reverend Ayanna Johnson Watkins, who is an executive director of a community organizing ministry in Memphis and a member of National Convocation. And we have Dr. Rick Lowry, a retired Hebrew Bible professor and a member of Theological Association of Disciples of Christ. I invite now Reverend Johnson to join us in this discussion and kick us off in this panel. Good evening, Reverend Johnson.
Good evening.
Welcome to this large platform we are in tonight. My question for you, on top of these list of questions each of you are going to be answering, is what are the implications of Dobbs upon the lives of those who are pregnant or those who are seeking pregnancy?
Well, I think if whenever I think of this decision, I always picture a spider web in my head, because the answers are never simplistic.
Mm.
So for those who are seeking pregnancy, those who are pregnant and maybe having complications, those who, as mothers, may be at risk, it definitely causes a heightened level of anxiety. I've talked to women who are facing complicated pregnancies to the point of risking their own health and well-being. I am having conversations with women who are being now forced to carry babies who are anencephalic or have some kind of condition where the baby will not be viable, and they're being forced to carry these babies to term because they cannot find alternative care. So, as the executive director of Disciples Women, who is always looking at issues of justice, spiritual formation, leadership development, the issues become that come to the forefront are justice and spiritual formation, right? Because this is legislative assault on women's bodies. That's one. And then what kind of spiritual disorder,
Hmm.
dysfunction, and other maladies are being created out of the anxiety, the depression, the fear, the confusion, the isolation, the possible denigration, especially when they come from very politically conservative families, very religiously conservative families that don't necessarily agree, right? To the point that women are now breaking ties with family members and church members, and is causing lots of confrontation. So I think the immediate effect is disorder.
Yeah.
And I would even say holistic disorder, because that disorder hits on so many of those areas that I named and ones that don't, that I didn't. And secondary to the immediate disorder becomes dysfunction,
Mhm.
dysfunctional behaviors. I was not born when Roe versus Wade gave us the constitutional right to abortion. And now in 2022, 23, and beyond, I am stressed for my sisters in this country as they seek a holistic form of health care
Mhm.
for their bodies. And so it's caused this ministry, my executive committee, and my constituents, my friends, my colleagues to think in a very different way about how we do ministry, because it's no longer we're going to pray for it. That is gone. We have to pray with our hands, our feet, and our ballot box.
What are some of those changes that your ministry has had to do in just 1 year's time?
Well, in 1 year's time, we have not only coming out of a pandemic and really, relaunching as a functional ministry beyond the pandemic. We're now deciding what does it really look like to provide ministry to a woman who is looking to have an abortion, who needs to have an abortion, who wants that as an option. How do we facilitate conversations that clarify and delineate someone who is pro-choice
Hmm.
versus someone who is anti-abortion, because those are two different things.
Mhm.
As the church, the fallacy of playing nice in church is that we don't like to have hard conversations. We do not like to hurt people's feelings, but we also hide behind certain misguided interpretations, right, of
Mm.
scripture, religious tradition, um, faith misnomers,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so we are having to go out and really pull people in. What I'm finding is that I have colleagues who are willing and able to have that conversation, who are very willing and happy to have that conversation. But I'm also finding that I am um, seeing people who are very scared because they don't want to cause dissension in the church. They don't want to
Mhm.
cause confrontation or conflict. Well, conflict is a very healthy thing, because out of that, if we do it in good faith, in trust, and in love, we can come up with great answers to help serve the world and really be that movement for wholeness in a fragmented world that we claim to be.
Yeah.
You
It
know?
almost seems like it harkens back to that spiderweb image you started
Yeah.
with. It's pulling on threads that perhaps were from our more shadow sides of our lives, some of our
Yes.
scars or some of our wounds that we have had to strive to overcome. Um,
Mhm.
I almost heard you say it was in a way giving birth to some more destructive or detrimental aspects to life instead of creating flourishing life.
Absolutely. One thing I love that our OGMP says when she talks about the Narrative Project and truly being a loving faith community, she also says, let's do it, church, or we've got to do more than talk about it. We've actually got to
Mhm.
do the work and put the work in. And no truer words have ever been said. If we truly want to be a community faith called to love all, um, honestly, love them honestly, love them wholly, love them healthily, then
Mm,
this
amen.
conversation has to happen. Not love people from our perspective or how we believe they should be, right? Because Jesus did not love us based on how we should be. Jesus loved us as we were and had
Mhm.
interactions as with the communities as they were. And so we have to learn how to replicate that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, in the words of our OGMP, how are disciples women saying, let's do it, church? What are some of those positive tugs or those life giving tugs on this spider web that you and your area of ministry are inviting us to partner with?
Well, this is one of them, right?
Mhm.
As
Yes.
we um, continue to have conversation with the Office of the General Minister and President, as we continue to have conversation with our resident scholars like Dr. Rick Lowry, and we have conversations with the regional women around the regions, right? In the 31 regions, as they begin to start having in person events and start gathering more
Mhm.
post pandemic, thank goodness. I am bringing up these conversations and just saying, hey, what do you think about this? You know,
Yeah.
how is it affecting your congregations? And then bringing it back to my resource committee and says, here's what our constituency is saying. Here's what Disciples Women is saying. What can we do to create some resourcing, right? I've even had someone ask me, do we have a fund to help people get to a state? And we don't. In a perfect world, we would. But what other resources? We're now in the process of assessing what other resources we can provide on a sustainable basis to help facilitate the conversations, keep people connected to resources, and even provide resourcing where we can.
All right. So, I hear that, church. Reverend Johnson is inviting you, regions, to connect and maybe let's drum up some funds to help each other.
That's right.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Reverend Johnson. We'll be pulling you back in a
Yes.
little bit. And thank you for your words and for your work.
Thank you.
I would like to invite now Reverend Stephanie McLemore, a campus minister and chaplain at Denison University, someone who works with young people day in, day out, who are primarily impacted from this um, in their daily lives. I think we're waiting to get Stephanie on board with us here. There you are. Good evening.
Hi,
Hello, Reverend McLemore. I'm so glad you could be with us tonight.
I'm so glad to be here. As
Yeah.
you can imagine, this discussion is happening on college campuses everywhere.
Mhm.
Um, Women in their 20s are most often seekers
Mm.
of pregnancy services and abortion services. And I think students were significantly caught off guard.
Oh, okay. Say more about that.
um, for most of our students, this is the first time that it has ever occurred to them that medical decisions and that rights could be taken away.
Mm.
America's all about progress. And for so many of our students, this just felt like the bottom dropped out of their experience of maturing and growing. Um, what we know about young adults these days is that they have very high anxiety. They're
Mm.
worried about higher education, the costs of it. They're worried about employment afterwards. They're worried about security. and they may not have the resilience of past generations. And what we know is the pandemic made all of that worse.
Hmm. It also sounds like you're saying they have very little autonomy or control over their lives.
Yes. Um, College has always been a time where you go and explore and learn. And I think it feels more choreographed. I think there's definitely more of a focus on outcomes these days. All colleges and universities right now focus more on career outcomes than advertising that there's a place to come and explore higher learning. Right? They're a place to
Okay.
prepare for careers. Um, so there's been impact on mental health, which is already fragile.
Hmm.
Counseling centers across the country are bursting at the seams. Uh,
How are you seeing student interactions? Because I imagine this is something that is not just impacting women and people who can get pregnant, but this is impacting um, everyone of childbearing age and childbearing possibilities, men, women, across the gamut. How
it
is this
is.
changing their interactions?
So health centers across the country have kind of changed operational procedures. Um, Counseling advice is still there, but many of the facilities that we would have referred students to are not running at the same capacity or even in communities anymore. Um, Many schools do have some private funding to assist with out of state travel, but college students don't have extra money. They don't have extra time to travel. Um, College students are at higher risk for sexual assault on campus. Um, those are the numbers.
And when the bottom drops out, the anxiety is higher, the more out of control you feel. I imagine things coming out sideways in sexual assault and asserting dominance is increasing.
It is, and even in states that have put in exceptions for sexual assault, some of those exceptions involve increased reporting measures, which we know are actually put more barriers into seeking care and assistance.
Say
Um,
unpack that a little bit more.
so, if there is a legal exception uh, for rape or incest, often a woman must file a police report or claim the assault to authorities in order to obtain that exemption. Um, and we need to have less barrier to medical
Mhm.
care than more. Um,
It seems like there is a level of policing of um, bodies and the ability to make decisions on behalf of your bodies,
well,
not just
isn't
on the
that the
medical
basic
side, but
issue?
also on the reporting side. Say that. I'm sorry. Say that again.
I said, and isn't that the basic issue?
Yes.
Um, the more barriers we put between women being able to make choices for their own spider web of situations. I
Mhm.
love that
Yeah,
image.
I was getting that image right now as well of that what strings are we tugging on, and so therefore what almost dominoes fall because of that one pull.
Yeah. It also changed, this decision also changes the business policy around higher education institutions. And so it changes the flavor of higher education. Health
What
and,
does it kind of look like day in and
health
day
and
out?
centers have to behave differently. There are some studies that are now saying students are making decisions about enrollment between universities in states that have more or less restrictive abortion laws.
Okay.
Um, and so even the business of higher education gets affected. Medical schools and what training they can and cannot provide to their students. So as you look at the overall impact on campus, we are not even able to train medical students and care providers in all states now in procedures,
Wow, that's mind blowing.
which starts to impact our care for generations.
Correct.
Um,
What kind of conversations are you having with your students or who are seeking religious counsel or support?
so I work with students across many faith traditions and all flavors of Christianity. They have varying theological traditions around um, everything, really. But none of my students believe that we should be pushing a binary yes or no decision
Mm-hmm.
on any person that lives in the complexity of the decisions of their life. We do
Yeah.
not live in a life where everything is a clear choice.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to trust and communicate that we are safe and loving and caring enough to trust the other individual and their own sense of spirituality to make the choices that are correct for them.
Yeah.
I think my students are in states of anger and disbelief, confusion, outrage, um, and they see this as just a symptom of the world that we live in. Young adults aren't really known for thinking that the church is relevant.
Mm.
And one of the reasons is that they don't see the church having these discussions and these hard conversations. And they want to see people of faith
Mm-hmm.
ask and struggle and not recite platitudes, but understand that we each are responsible for our journey and our faith and for how we treat and respect others.
Yeah. And I think it harkens back to Reverend Johnson's image of to trust that this web can hold our questions and the complexity.
And
Yeah.
if the church is not the place for truth and community, and if it's not the place for the lost and the needy, then what is?
Yeah. Well,
I think
thank
the other
you.
thing,
Continue.
I will just add, I think the other things my students are highly aware of is that the impact is disproportionately on people of color, folks of low income, first generational students, folks without access to travel funds. I think my students are very aware
Mm-hmm.
of the disproportionality of the impact.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Reverend McLemore, for lifting that up and for the work that you do. I think this is a great time to transition to Reverend Ayana Johnson Watkins, who works with folks across the board, um, in community organizing, particularly in Memphis. But it's an interfaith organization and speaks and works with people from many walks of life. And so I invite Reverend Johnson Watkins to join us in this conversation and illuminate a little bit about how this is impacting people across many layers, many intersections of our world.
Hello, I'm here now.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Um, I do get to see.
Uh, Ayana, I think we're having some struggles with Ayana's camera. I'm looking to my team. Are we? Yeah, we're trying again. Isn't this how we always do at church? We just try it again. I can move on. We can invite Rick Lowry to provide us with some theological reflections as we are troubleshooting some technical difficulties. All right, we're moving on to Dr. Rick Lowry, a retired Hebrew Bible professor. Hello, Dr. Lowry. Thank you for bringing us a theological word tonight, primarily of specifically what's going on for disciples. How do we interpret the Dobbs decision? How do we bring our theology to life through our own actions, through our own words, through our own conversations?
Okay, can you hear me and see me okay? I
I
can't
can,
quite
yes.
tell. All right, okay, good. Um, First, I'd like to answer actually a question that you asked before,
Mm,
which was kind of what's the personal impact of this decision, and my ministry setting and all of that. Of course,
yeah.
I'm retired now, but I am married to a fantastic woman, and my daughter is a fantastic woman, and the freedom for both of them to choose to control their own bodies is very important to me. And the thought that they would now, by this decision, lose a right that they and my other women friends and acquaintances and colleagues, this fundamental human right that's been uh, clearly guaranteed for half a century, and just suddenly to have it taken away is
Mhm.
is just really disturbing to me, and troubling, and I fear for the health and safety of all kinds of women who I know and appreciate, and for the burdens that this decision may well put on families, just in
Mm.
general. You know, spouses and fellow, other members of the family. I'm very troubled by the entire this entire development. Um, Now, is it appropriate for me to talk about at this point uh, what will happen in our particular event on August 17th, or does that come later? Can I talk about that now?
Yeah, you can talk about that right
Okay.
now.
All right.
And
Okay. Okay. So what I'd like to talk about is the August 17th event. This will kick off this whole series, And what we'll have on August 17th is a panel discussion with disciples, biblical and theological scholars and academic leaders to about how the church can engage in moral reflection,
Mm,
action, advocacy in the wake of this Dobbs decision. In this, the format will be that I will moderate the discussion. Um, we'll have kind of brief presentations from a handful of disciples scholars who have given considerable biblical and theological thought to this issue. And then we'll have conversation and question and answers with the online audience. And our goal is to help us all bring our biblical and theological resources to bear in an informed way and a faithful way as we respond to these enormous pastoral
mhm.
challenges um, to this changed situation for individual people and for families in our churches and our communities and in our nation. The scholars will meet ahead of time to work collaboratively on the particulars of the discussion within the
As
broad
disciples
parameters
do.
that, yes, as disciples
Mhm.
do, within the broad parameters, that we've already established above. And again, our goal is to model informed and respectful conversation and to offer practical biblical and theological resources so we can have these conversations in our churches, in our
Yeah.
communities, in our regions, and in the halls of power. So that we can advocate for our sisters and our families in this, and ourselves in this changed environment. Now, in terms of the particular biblical resource, I just want to talk about a couple of things here now, if I might. There will
Yes,
be
please.
other things that will be talked about on August
Yeah. Give us
17th.
a little sneak peek of what that's going to be tonight.
Yes, I gave a little sneak peek, and I'm gonna give my own little sneak peek of
Great.
what of
Great.
some of the things that I think about this. And my students that I've had through the years in seminary and college and elsewhere will not be at all surprised that in my judgment the biblical theological foundation of this entire discussion is the remarkable assertion that we find in the first chapter of Genesis, chapter 1, verses 27, 28, that we are created male and female in, or actually, I think the better translation is created as the
Mm,
image of God in the earth. We are the very image of God in the earth. Um, and as such, all people are in some sense sacred,
mm,
and therefore they need to act and to be treated with utmost respect and honor. The image of God in the ancient Near East usually was applied to kings and emperors. It's a power term.
mm,
It means empowered to rule, empowered to govern, and the king was empowered to govern for himself and to govern himself and other people in the earth, and that is divinely given, and therefore to resist the power and authority of the king is to not just commit treason, but to commit blasphemy, because this is established in the heavens. The radical message of Genesis. So it's not odd that human beings sometimes were called, some human beings were called the image of God in the ancient world.
Mm.
What's radical about Genesis 1 is that every human being
Mm.
is said to be as the image of God in the earth, and
Yeah.
therefore has authority to exercise power in the world. And it's an astonishing claim, but there's more. Not only is this an astonishing claim that it's, broadly democratic, but in a generally patriarchal world, Genesis makes the revolutionary claim that it's not just men who are the image of God, it's women as well. It is
Amen.
the full human family.
Mhm.
And every individual one of us, male and female, in our full gender and bodily diversity together, who
Mhm.
reflect the image of God.
Yeah.
So, so this is, we reflect the image of God not in spite of our diversity, but because of our glorious
Mhm.
diversity. And I think that has to be the biblical theological conversation of this whole conversation.
Mhm.
The fundamental sacredness of human life and the empowerment of all human beings, regardless of gender identity, is our starting point and
Mhm.
the touchstone. Now, I think that all Christians and people of other faith traditions and in their own way, people of non-faith traditions would basically agree on this point. Though our history is full of religiously legitimated violence and oppression that's inconsistent with that core value. But I think that fundamental foundational
Mhm.
conviction that all human life is sacred is really the basis. That's where we begin.
Mhm.
Now, given that, there still are a number of unanswered, unsettled questions. For example, um, you know, and this is at the heart of the abortion discussion, is a disagreement about when exactly a human life, a person's life in a moral and legal sense begins and ends, right? So that's kind of the what's at issue in the whole abortion debate. Now, in one sense, the biblical answer is fairly straightforward. Birth and death mark the span of a human life.
Mm.
And living has to do fundamentally with breathing. Human life
Yeah.
begins when you start breathing, and it ends when you stop breathing. Genesis 2:7 says it this way. Then the Lord God, Yahweh God, formed the human from the dust of the ground and breathed into its nostrils the breath of life, and it became a living being.
Mm.
Okay. It's when it starts breathing. The Hebrew words there are nefesh chaya, literally a breathing life. So
Yeah.
when the breath of life is breathed into the nostrils, that's when we become a human being. And so it's and then when we stop breathing, that's when we die. Now, of course, in our modern world, our medical technology has um, had an impact on kind of how we think about beginning and end. So stopping breathing is not necessarily the end of your life, or our developments with prenatal care mean that we're just thinking differently about the beginning and end of life. Um, and so that has to be taken into account in our moral considerations as we think
Mhm.
about the issue. Now, I just want to say just a couple of more things, highlight a couple of more passages, and then I'll shut up. Um, there are a couple of poetic passages in Jeremiah and in Isaiah that
Mm.
speak of a prophet being
Yep.
called to be a prophet, quote, before they were born.
Mhm.
In Isaiah 49:1, the prophet says that he or she or they were called by God, quote, before I was born.
Mhm.
And I was named while I was in my mother's womb.
Yeah.
But verse 3 of that passage makes it clear that the I that's being talked about here is not an individual person. It says explicitly, he said to me, you are my servant Israel, in whom I will be glorified. So this person who has been chosen, quote, before being formed in the womb, is the nation Israel, or at least in this passage, the folks who are returning from Babylonian exile. So this is not talking about the biological lifespan
Mhm.
of an individual. It's talking metaphorically about the national birth or rebirth in this case of Israel.
Mm.
Jeremiah 1:5 is another passage. It does refer to an individual person, Jeremiah, and his calling to be a prophet to the nations. But again, it's not referring to biological lifespan. The actual wording is this: before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I consecrated you and appointed you to be a prophet to the nations. The issue here was that Jeremiah was a boy when he started prophesying, and people were saying, you're too young.
Mhm.
And so Jeremiah is saying, hey, God chose me before I was even formed in the womb. It's not only from the point of conception, it's from before the point of
Mhm.
conception that Jeremiah is chosen. So again, this is a metaphorical
Mhm.
kind of comment, and it's not really a statement about when the human lifespan begins. Um, I just want to do one final passage, and then I'll stop, and that is Exodus chapter 20, 21, verse 22. Wait, is it 22, 21, or 21? Can't remember. Um, Anyhow, and it's a statement about how you treat a miscarriage, an accidental miscarriage.
Mm.
Uh, when people who are fighting, it says, injure a pregnant woman so that there is a miscarriage, and yet no further harm follows, the one responsible will be fined what the woman's husband demands. Okay, so there are a lot of problematic things about that,
Mhm.
which I mean, that whole chapter is problematic all the way around. But at any rate, um, the issue here with the accidental unintentional miscarriage or abortion is it's a property issue. I mean, it has to do with workers for the household, with family members who can work to ensure the survival of the ancestral property. And so there's a fine involved in that. Okay. Now, um, so the person who caused it will pay what the husband demands, paying as much as the judges determine. If, however, any harm follows to the woman, then the rule is life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for so it's the old life for life
Mhm.
rule that goes into effect when um, you kill a human being. Okay, so the inference here is that the unborn is treated differently from a moral point of view than the already born human woman.
Mm.
Okay, and the already human woman is treated according to the normal rules of, what happens when you injure a human being, which is
Mhm.
eye for eye, tooth for tooth, life for life. Now, of course, we're more civilized than that today, or
Yeah.
we have a different moral sensibility about that. But the point here is that in Exodus, the two are thought of as different.
Mhm.
The fetus is not unimportant. It's valued. It's tragic, in a sense, if that life is
Mhm.
lost. But it's qualitatively a different thing
Mhm.
than the life of the woman.
It
So
sounds like it's going back to your foundational statement of
the
everything
foundational,
cycles back to us being the image,
that's right,
image of
and
God.
Exactly right. And so the Bible doesn't speak directly about abortion. I mean, it doesn't talk about it, at least as far as I know. But these passages provide certain, inferences that I think give us principles that we can apply to our very different situation
Mhm.
today. And again, there are a lot of other factors that need to come into play. The Bible is only one resource for us for our moral reasoning. But anyhow, these are some passages that I imagine we will on August 17th bat around,
Dive
and
into more deeply. Yes.
and and
Certainly
and
give us
so
some
so
food for
I'll
thought.
quit now. I know I've gone over my time, so I'll stop.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lowry. And that's a further plug and invitation for everyone to join us on August 17th for the follow up of this, for a deeper dive and conversation on the theological ramifications of this conversation. I think we're able now to move to Reverend Ayanna Johnson Watkins, who can give us a more on the ground, in day to day life understanding of how this is impacting people of many faiths in her work in Memphis with a community organizing agency. So I invite Reverend Ayanna Johnson Watkins to join us. All right. Good evening and welcome.
Good evening. How are we
So
doing?
glad we were able to work around the technology to make it work for us. Isn't it always good when it does that? Yes, glad you are here with us. And I am so curious, since based upon your work, not only on the ground in a broader community sense than just a campus or a congregation, but also interfaith. How are you seeing this impacting your communities, and what kinds of conversations are happening amongst neighbors and community members based upon Dobbs?
Sure. So, yes, I'm an organizer now, and I'm coming up on 20 years of ministry. And so, I've been an
God
organizer, I've
bless
been a
it.
social worker, I've been a youth pastor, I've been a new church planter, and I've been a writer. And in each of those arenas, you get to see a lot of things. Um, like you, when I was pastoring, you sit with people in these critical moments in their lives: birth, death, loss, miscarriage, stillbirth, fertility treatments, all of the things. Um, and so I've been privileged to be with people in these moments, and I've sat with women who've been considering abortion. And so, again, these aren't quick fix answers, as Reverend Johnson was saying. You can't just make a quick decision. I mean, these aren't simple things. Um, they're complicated. I think the web is a great image. There's just a lot of things that touch other things. In the interfaith community, it's a real struggle because as we organize, we have to organize around things we have consensus on. And the outcome of Roe v. Wade versus the outcome of the Dobbs decision is not something that we've been able to come to any consensus around in interfaith circles. So it limits our work in that arena. Um, I'll say, as a member of National Convocation and just as someone who moves around in a lot of Black church spaces and Black faith spaces, in addition to the theological back and forth, which thank you, Rick, for just laying that out for us and giving us some clear things to really digest. For us in sort of everyday pew to pew kind of situations, we find that there's a layer on top of the faith layer, and that is the way the Black body is politicized, and in particular, the way Black fertility and labor, childbirth and productivity, procreation, and even sexual behavior has been a matter of political discourse. You know, we talk about the Black welfare queen having too many children. Or we walk back to slavery, we're talking about women's bodies, women being used as breeders to have more children, to do more work on a plantation. There's not been a time in recent history or in the last several hundred years when Black women's bodies in particular have not been part of capitalism. They have not been part of the free market, if that makes any sense. And so this moment where we find ourselves again having lost more rights to our bodies and the right to make decisions about our bodies is, as it was with George Floyd, painfully familiar, right? The trauma is still there, the hurt is still there, but it's painfully familiar. And I have seen a struggle with that in Black faith communities because of the ways in which we've interpreted or misinterpreted biblical texts that tend to look upon women who cannot have children as cursed in some way, and women who can have children as being a service to someone else, their husband, their family of origin. So it never gets to sort of be about the person, and we're often judged by those behaviors. So you have a Black woman who gets pregnant and wasn't ready to be pregnant, wasn't ready to be a mom, but now she's either going to be judged because she had an abortion or judged because she had this baby before she was ready or out of wedlock, right? So there's no winning in so many of these conversations. And that goes all the way over to fertility and infertility. You know, again, there's this sort of constant, if it's untreated, untested, unquestioned biblical image of women being cursed with barrenness. But thanks be to God that there's, you know, so many of those stories are followed by that redemptive narrative of God bringing them back. But there's something about that sort of hangs in the church DNA that we don't talk about. This sort of like, even if the person is sympathetic, it's like, oh, I'm so sorry you couldn't have children, right? Like there's not any complication of that narrative. And so I think in addition to the emotional, you know, the faith complications, theological complications, there are also emotional complications as well as the bodily complications. So the way in which this decision really hits home for me is that I have two daughters, right? I have to raise them in a particular way, and we have to. But sometimes in some circles, and as I'm going to do tonight, I'll say I have two daughters, but I've been pregnant 5 times. And the process for going through a miscarriage used to have a couple of different options for how a woman recovers in the case of a miscarriage. One of which was a D&C, right? A D and C. It happens to be, as so many of us know, the same procedure that is used in what's considered an abortion. But in this case, it is a way of removing the tissue of a lost pregnancy. I have now talked to several women who now have had to deal with a lack of options after a miscarriage because their doctor cannot perform a D&C in the case of a miscarriage. And it can take weeks and up to months for that to happen, quote, naturally.
Correct.
I can't even unpack, right? Like the emotional and physical weight of carrying a lost pregnancy until your body decides it's ready to get rid of it. And so there's so much there. And then we don't talk about that, and there's not a lot of room for it, even in faith circles, to have those conversations. Women are left carrying that on their own without the theological resources to help give them their own redemptive narrative.
that web, it breaks apart, it falls apart, and real life people fall through it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
in that rupture, that fracture of that space. I just want to say, Reverend Johnson Watkins, I am humbled and grateful for your vulnerability in sharing some of your personal story. Part of this Dobbs decision is it is not just a legal decision. It is a true intersection of not just our faith, um, but our lives, our bodies, um, the ways in which we can even access care. As you have mentioned, there's been a tremendous policing of medical care providers and what they are able to provide, regardless of their training and regardless of their own choice and decision, because there's legal ramification on their ends to provide a holistic care. In what ways are you seeing in your community and in your conversations some of those intersections that might be weaving a new way, a new thread around, or perhaps um, through this decision?
One of the things that um, I continue to see burgeoning around us in our state is support groups.
Mm.
The more times somebody talks about this, the more
Amen.
other people who have experienced it, right, start to bubble up, women and men. Um, we only have we only had two fertility assistance places in Memphis where one could go to get fertility treatment because one of them provided abortion as well. They are no longer operating in this space, right?
Mhm.
So now you have now you've gotten into reproductive justice from another level where you can't access care because it physically doesn't exist in the space, and
Correct.
you've impacted other folks who need services in the same field but aren't even actually seeking an abortion. um, and so I think the person to person support is going to be really critical for us right now. But
Yeah.
also, I see organizing happening. Um, there is a newish Tennessee group that is formed now around fertility and reproductive justice that's operating here. Sister Reach
Mm.
operates here in Memphis as well and does organizing at the state and federal level. And so this is what always happens, right? I see it as the remnant.
Yeah.
Whenever
Yeah.
evil tries to crush a whole
Uh-huh.
movement, the remnant will reemerge and organize.
You
And when
brought
people
tears to
see
my eyes when you mentioned this. I was like, oh, thank you, God, thank you, Jesus, for
it's
this.
happening,
Yes,
the
yes.
people are organizing. And when the South gets organized, honey, you can't stop us because you can't tell us what to do on a good day.
Thank God.
So
Thank
don't
God.
get on our nerves. People will come for you.
Oh, I hope so. Those of us here in the Midwest, we welcome you. And please bring all of your desserts with you because they're the
Red
best.
velvet caramel cake.
Uh huh. Yes. Yes. Oh, well, again, thank you, Reverend Johnson Watkins, for your tremendous witness, both professionally and personally. There will be more time for some more of your remarks. Um, those of you who are joining us at home, we do encourage you, please write your questions in the public chat. We will be bringing them on. I think at this point in time, it might be a good idea to bring all of our panelists up on the screen and await some of those rousing questions that I know I have a tremendous amount, but right now it's time to turn to the church and see what they say, because that's what we disciples do. It's not about those of us who are the talking heads or behind the pulpits or with the titles. It's about what the people have to say. Um, so we await your questions. And I want to say thank you to each of our panelists for your courageous work, what you're doing day in and day out, not only in your professional lives, but in your personal lives. And we have our first question What does community care look like for women experiencing the same stories Ayana and others have described? Who who has a response to that, or would you like me to just call on you?
I'm looking at Stephanie because I can answer because they called my name, but I was also thinking there might
Well,
be stories
I
in
think
others.
community care looks like it does in so many of our congregations, right? It starts with a casserole or a card. It starts with a phone call. It starts with making space in the church building for a support group. Um, the church is really good about taking care of people who we know and who we see.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we need to push our boundaries a little bit and ask who's in a place where we don't see them and who's not in the pew yet. Um, on campus, I have fleets of resident assistants and environmental service workers who will knock on my door and say, "Hey, so and so over there, you should send them a note."
Oh, God bless those
Um,
angels.
at University of Lynchburg, the cafeteria staff, they knew who was in trouble. Um, we don't always have those things in our neighborhoods.
Mm,
And I know that our transient lifestyle makes that even more difficult in our churches,
mm-hmm.
but we just have to be on the lookout.
Yeah.
And
And
we
I think,
have to find things to do with our church buildings to open them up to more and more creative ways to serve more and more needs.
yeah.
Mhm.
And I
I'll
think,
say
as
in
Reverend Johnson mentioned, just talking about it. Um,
Absolutely. I think,
one of
conversation.
both of the support groups that surrounded me and so many other of the people in our lives. Can you hear me still? Okay.
yes. Yep.
Um,
We'll do Reverend Johnson Watkins, and then we'll go to Reverend Johnson, and then we'll go to our next question.
oh, okay. Thank
Mm-hmm.
you. Both of the support groups that I accessed were out of church spaces. Um, so one was a non-denominational church, and the other was United Church of Christ. And um, we met and borrowed many church spaces to meet from other denominations. So this was across denominations, I would say, in which this care and support came. And even though we're talking about women, these groups also had special group sessions for men and for what it means for men to be going through infant loss, miscarriage, and these similar journeys. So I think that's really important to remember, um, to figure out where you do have power and where you can make a systemic change, where you can make a change in an institution. Can you create a support group? Can you, if you're an employer, um, can you create policy that allows for extra leave, days off, additional sick time? Can you expand the definition of bereavement leave? Can There are so many things we have control over, some of us have control over that we have not taken seriously or thought about. Wait a minute, is there a way I can do more justice through whatever modicum of decision making power I do have?
Mm-hmm. Reverend Johnson.
Yeah, I think, like we were saying before, the power of conversation. I think we have to get to a place where we trust that the bonds of Christian faith, the bonds of our faith that call us into community, are stronger than the tentacles and the pieces of the web that we're
Mm-hmm.
trying to dismantle and distangle. And so when we trust that the bonds between us as members of this community of faith are stronger than that, then I can see a Yana. I can see
Mm-hmm.
this person or that person for who they really are and give them space. Give them space to be authentic and vulnerable safely, right? And then, not taking it unto themselves and doing nothing with it, but doing exactly what Reverend Ayana said: decide where our sphere of influence is and our capacity to affect change. Not first order change where we acquiesce and coalesce and band aid, but real change that reorders the system or
Mm,
even dismantles the system so that a new one can be created, right? Yeah.
yeah, that is a good word. Thank you. And you two have already naturally started taking us into what our next question was. This feels so big. Where do we get started? What is a small step? And I think listening, forming those support groups, each of those is a great first step. What are some other tangible, concrete things that um, our people at home and in our churches and in our communities can start doing to begin reordering and restructuring that web?
So
I'm gonna go back to go for it,
Oh,
Reverend Johnson.
okay.
Please
So my
kick us off.
mind is always, how do I get to where I need to be? Right.
Mm,
And so Reverend Ayana and I are both organizers trained under the same institution. And so I think in some ways my mind always clicks back to my organizing training, this
mhm,
clarifying the issue, talking to people, having one-on-ones, because I've got to find someone who is interested and has a self-interest in changing this disordered system as well, and continuing to have those conversations within those groups and deciding, where the powers and the spheres of influence lie outside of our group. Who do we need to be
mm,
talking to? Who do we need to have at a table? Decide, are we doing an advocacy piece? Are we doing an activism piece? Are we just going to um, exercise our capacity to execute some charity? Because all of those things matter. It's not all activism, it's not all advocacy, it's not all charity. It is a nice combination and balance of both, because we've
mhm,
got to pull the bodies out of the river. We also got to figure out why they're coming downstream to
mhm.
begin with.
Yeah.
And so creating a network where one person is not doing it alone,
Mm,
um, because that is what creates power: organized people and organized money. Because on the other side, if you look at the other side of this issue, lots of money and lots of people have been organized and mobilized in a way that they are coming off the tarmac, the political issue tarmac, like jet planes. And so we
mhm,
have to get ourselves in that position so that we can do the same.
mhm.
Yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Lowry, I turn to you as a gathered intentionally as a church, and a church that really likes to dig into scripture. And I know my church, we like to keep things up here. I know that's not all churches and disciples, but how do we take it out of our heads and into action? What are some of those first steps that we can bring the theology and the Bible studies, take them off the page?
Yeah. Well, in my judgment, a beginning is just conversation within our congregations, and just having the courage to talk about these things, and to study the scriptures together, and to think
Mhm,
about what can we do to advocate. Um, I think that. Um, uh, it was a really good point. I mean, these folks who have worked on getting rid of Roe for 50 years. I mean, they had a long term strategy, and one thing that those of us who believe this is a fundamental matter of human rights, and of you know biblical image. We need our motto needs to be, and yet we persisted. We must persist, and just keep at it. It's going to be a while. It's going to
Mhm.
be a while before we get a Supreme Court that's going to undo some of this stuff. And unfortunately, this has just become so polarized, I don't know. It's taken a really. I should have seen it all coming, but I didn't. I still I still was so shocked by the Dobbs decision. It just amazed me. But uh, there are good resources out there. I mean, one of the I didn't talk about people who are going to be involved in the August 17th webinar because we haven't fully put together the
No.
group yet. But one of the people who definitely will be joining us is Dr. Lisa Davison, who has written a really nice book called "More Than a Womb." Child-free women as agents of the holy,
Mm.
which is a book that I would recommend to all of you. But there are a lot of resources I think that are out there, and I suspect there will be more in the pipeline
Mhm.
in light of Dobbs. We've just got to keep talking about it, and we've got to turn our talk into marching,
Mm.
and we've got to advocate, and we've got to provide the compassionate pastoral care, whatever we can provide. uh, you know it This has just really created a very bad situation,
Mhm.
and it just was unnecessary, but
Yeah.
it's where we are.
Thank you, Dr. Lowry. We have one final question, particularly geared toward Reverend Ayana and Reverend Stephanie. I think pertaining to what Dr. Lowry talks about of that long arc, and how it might be a long arc, but we see it impacting people's lives now. Um, so, how does your work with interfaith settings mean um, of support and organizing around reproductive justice? What could that look like, or how should we begin take those first steps? Just a very brief response for our closing remarks.
I guess I will add that the Dobbs decision is one small piece of a larger cloud around the next evolution of who women will be in our life, in our society. And I see the young women that I work with ready for that evolution. I'm a single mother by choice. I have a non traditional family. So many of our rights are intertwined. And for men too, we're redefining maleness at the same time. We're redefining gender fluidity. And I think young adults are ready for the discussion long term.
Amen. Uh, Reverend Ayana.
I think it's an important one that we could stand to have more often. Um, for me, the way I've already said, it's hard for us to get consensus around this because our faith traditions do vary quite a bit around theologies around life and death, and even suffering in children. But what I will say is one of the places that you can get us together is when we ground ourselves in the dignity of humanity.
Mm.
And that's not, and when we don't limit it to the unborn,
Yeah.
that we need to dignify human life, all of human life.
Amen.
And that is where we can find our footing. It's where we can say, okay, maybe I can't stand in this spot with, with this sign. But what I can say is, um, every human being has a right to decide and get the best medical care they can for the things that ail them. Right? We can get to that. It can become a health care problem. It can become an economic problem. If we're going to limit abortion, then where is the expansion on economic supports for folks who are financially struggling and trying to raise a family now that they knew they couldn't afford? So trying to figure out how we can expand the conversation, and even like we said, just getting insurance to cover fertility treatments, getting insurance to cover care after a miscarriage. Like, so many of these pieces we could be putting back together in place, and these are things we can circle together and come together around, even if we can't agree on some of the more publicized religious, political stances.
Thank you. Thank you,
And everyone
panelists.
values family. Everyone values family, whether it's family by birth or family by chosen.
Mhm.
We all value that connectedness and those people close to us.
And we are looking forward to being together in that chosen family and friendship very soon in General Assembly. I'd like to invite Yvonne Gilmore to bring us a word from the General Minister and President, and what will lead into our General Assembly next month in Louisville. Good evening and welcome. Not Brenda Rossi. I encourage you to introduce yourself. Tell us who you are, what you do, and a word from our General Minister.
Absolutely. Friends, my name is Reverend Yvonne Gilmore. I serve as Vice President and Chief of Staff in the Office of the General Minister and President. Our General Minister and President, Terry Owens, due to travel, was not able to be with us, but in fact is watching online. Want to convey her gratitude to all who worked so hard to make this happen, to the National Benevolent Association, to Disciples Women and the Disciples Women Endowment Fund, whose generosity enabled this to happen, and the staff, Kara Gilger, and the Office of the General Minister and President. And then also want to thank, you don't see her, but the Reverend Charisma Jean-Marie is the project manager and worked tirelessly to put this together. And so we're just so grateful. Reverend Owen, she lifted up, she said to all our panelists, thank you for bringing your brilliance and your heart to the church as we discuss this important topic. So grateful for each of you. Want you to know, if you have not signed up to attend General Assembly, we will be in Louisville for the first time in 4 years. At the end of July, it's not too late. You can still register. GADisciples.org. Please do make plans to join us. Know that this conversation is also going to be happening in the context of the workshop entitled I'm With Her, Creating Sanctuary. I'm with her, Creating Sanctuary. There will be a workshop there. Certainly, this will continue August 17th and in the weeks and months to come. The God of limitless love, the God that is moving this movement for wholeness. I'm so grateful for these courageous leaders. This is not an easy conversation to have, and are so grateful for each of them, and the intelligence, the compassion, the spiritual maturity and sensitivity, and their example as they lead us to see that God dwells, that limitless love, it dwells in dialogue, that limitless love is performed when we actively, right, make space to among our difference, right? We don't all think the same, but indeed, we're called even to unity amidst our difference of thinking and being. So we're so grateful for each of you. Hope to see you in Louisville.
Thank you so much, Reverend Yvonne, for that word from our General Minister and President, but also just about how we can further this conversation and our participation when we gather at the Assembly. I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. If you're joining us tonight, or if you're watching this in the future, thank you for your passion and your heart and your commitment to this justice issue and the ways it gets lived out in people's real lives and real bodies. I want to thank our panelists and all of those behind the scenes, and to go in the love and the light of our God, as Dr. Lowry lifted up, go in the image of God, which means to have power and to share. We have the power and the calling to love and serve our God by simply loving and serving our neighbors. So thank you, church, for being the church in all of the ways we do that and bringing forth the love and the light of our God. Go in peace, rest well tonight. And I know I look forward to our panel's continuation and our work in the future. Have a good evening.